My name is Sean Egglestone, and I am a registered dietitian in the state of Oregon. And I work both clinically with inpatients as well as outpatients. And I've put together a little presentation based on some materials I feel that would be very helpful for my community. So we're going to go ahead and move along here. First, we're going to start off with this one slide, which is more filling. 2 fig Newtons or a cantaloupe. And it's interesting to note that these two foods have the same ratio of fats, carbs, and proteins. But what we find is that obviously the cantaloupe, an entire cantaloupe, is going to be more filling than 2 fig Newtons. And we're going to talk more about this later. So we're going to start off real basic here and just go over some of the macronutrients, because when you look at a lot of popular diets, they play around with what we call the macronutrient ratios, or the proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. So we're going to go over what are these foods exactly and why they're important. So first, we're going to go over proteins in no particular order. They function in the body very importantly to help build muscle, repair tissue. They are essential. They're very, very important. Certain sources that we can get these from, typically, people think of protein as coming from meat, fish, eggs, cheese, also things like milk. A glass of milk will have protein in it, but we also get protein from things like beans, grains, nuts, and seeds, and foods made from those products like bread. It's important to note that protein has 4 calories per gram. So for its weight, for a pound of protein, you're going to get about 1,800 calories, and we'll talk more about this later. So carbs. Carbs are a major source of energy. They're also a source of fiber, right? Because when we think about carbs, things like pasta, potatoes, and rice, these foods, not only do they have carbohydrates in them, but they also have non-digestible carbohydrates called fiber. Certain sources, things like fruits, vegetables, grains, and legumes. It's important to note that carbohydrates only come from plant products. They do not come from animal products. So when you eat chicken or fish or beef, there are no carbohydrates in those products. The only exception for animal products being dairy, you have the lactose sugar. And they're also 4 calories per gram or 1,800 calories per pound. Last but not least, for our macronutrients, we have fat. And fat is also important for things like our hair and our skin health. Temperature regulation, right? So we have adipose tissue or fat tissue that helps as insulators for our body. It also provides support and structure for our internal organs. There's small amounts of fat in nearly all foods. I can't think of any food off the top of my head that comes from nature that's fat-free. They all have some amount of fat from them. Even vegetables, grains, beans, nuts and seeds obviously have more fat per pound. There's significant more quantities, generally speaking, in animal products like meats and dairy. Right? So the number one source of things like saturated fat in the American diet comes from our dairy products, cheese and milk. Now these fat calories are very energy dense. We get a lot of calories for the weight, twice as much as we do from carbs and fats. We're looking at 4,100 calories per pound or 9 calories per gram. It's also important to note that there's a high conversion rate of dietary fat to body fat. So when we eat things like carbohydrates and protein in excess of what we need, they get converted to fat. But in the process of converting carbs and protein to body fat, some of that is burned off as energy or fuel to create that conversion process. However, because the fat that we eat gets stored in an almost identical fashion to the fat when it gets stored, there's a very low energy needed for that turnover, which means if you overeat on fat, you're more likely to store 97% of those calories instead of closer to 75% of those calories for carbs and protein. So just as a quick example, if you overeat in a given day by 100 calories on proteins or carbs, they'll be stored as fat in the body in a quantity equal to 75 calories. But if you overeat on fat, you'll store that fat in a quantity equal to 97 calories. But there's some other macronutrients that a lot of these diets completely ignore. And the first one is fiber. Fiber, people don't consider carbs to be essential, but I consider fiber to be absolutely essential. As essential or even more so than carbs, fats, and protein. You need fiber to help flush out the colon. It binds to toxins and removes them from the body. It also helps feed the good gut bacteria. So we're about 100 trillion cells, our body, and 90 trillion of them is actually bacteria. And our immune system, our mood, so much of our body and the way we function is dedicated or has to do with the function of the bacteria in our gut. And so fiber acts as what we call a prebiotic. It feeds that good bacteria. Very, very important for reducing our risk for things like colon cancer. Now keep in mind, fiber, just like carbohydrates, are only found in plant foods. Fiber helps the plants stand up. Muscle helps the animals stand up. So things like fruits, vegetables, grains, and legumes, these last two are the highest in fiber. Highest in fiber. Keep that in mind. Now, also keep in mind that fiber, generally speaking, is 0 calories per gram. There is some calorie intake from bacterial degradation, but generally speaking, 0 calories per gram. And the last forgotten macronutrient, and the reason I term these macronutrients is because of the sheer volume or weight that we need to consume every day. When you think of micrograms, like you think of B12, or you think of vitamin D or something like that, or vitamin A, we need these things in exceptionally small amounts. But things like water and fiber, we need them in the quantity of grams, ounces, or pounds. Water is essential for the chemical reactions in our body to take place. That's why dehydration is so deadly, is because it alters how the chemistry in our body takes place. It's very, very important for bowel regularity. Think of people that are constipated. They're often dehydrated. And it's also important for temperature control, like sweating and flushing out toxins. Now, sources of water, besides just drinking it straight up, it's found in very high quantities in things like fruits and vegetables. As much as 80% of the weight of fruits and vegetables comes from the water content. Cooked grains and pastas, right? So when I look at the weight of food per pound, and that's more of a shopping tip we'll talk about later, you notice that when you cook grains or pasta, they triple in size. They gain weight, and that's from the water that they're absorbing. And water is, of course, 0 calories per gram. So let's put all of these together in an awesome, awesome diagram that has been a vision of mine for some time. So what we have here, we have our fiber and our water. And we put our carbs. Remember, carbs only come from plant foods. Plant foods only have carbs. Now keep in mind also fiber only comes from plant foods. We also get a lot of water from plant foods. Now the thing with animal foods, with the exception of milk, when you cook meat, where did my mouse go? When you cook meat, you're cooking off the water. You're losing the water. So animal foods tend to be higher in protein, and they tend to be higher in fat. Now plant foods do have some fat. We talked about nuts and seeds and beans. Plant foods do tend to have protein, But animal foods tend to be higher in protein and fat. So why is that a big issue? Okay, so let's just recap. Fiber and water, no calories, takes up space in our stomach and has weight. So these things make us feel full without adding any calories to our diet. That's why plant foods are extremely important in things like weight loss. Fiber is only found in plant foods, and it's typically paired with foods high in carbohydrates. You're not finding foods high in fiber that are also high in protein or high in fat. So, carbohydrates, again, 1,800 calories per pound. Only found in plant foods, and they're typically paired with foods that are high in fiber and water. So as we move along the caloric density scale here, noted at the bottom, we're moving over to animal foods. Animal foods are comprised of protein and fat. There's no fiber or carbs in animal foods. So when you eat a diet high in plant foods, you are getting protein and you are getting fat. But you notice that fat is 4,100 calories per pound. And so you tend to have foods higher in fat on the animal scale than on the plant scale. And because, carbs and protein are the same calories per pound. So weight gain or weight loss, strictly speaking, the same calories per pound. But keep in mind that protein, when we're talking about animal foods, protein in animal foods is often packaged with fat. Whether it's chicken in an 80-20 split, or if it's a high fat cut of beef, where it's more of a 50-50 split, you're looking at protein and fat being combined together. So you're looking at a combination of 1,800 calories per pound and 4,100 calories per pound. Whereas when you eat plant foods, you're looking at a combination of no calories per pound, of 1,800 calories per pound, and then there's a little bit of fat in there, but not a whole lot, generally speaking, with the exception of avocados and coconuts, which I know for a lot of my audience, we're not consuming high amounts of avocados and coconuts. So proteins, again, moderate amounts in plant foods, right? You can survive solely on plant foods and not be protein deficient. There's a large amount of protein in things like dairy and meat, and they're typically paired with high fat foods. They're also paired with cholesterol, right? Because plant foods that are high in fiber, water, and carbs do not have any cholesterol. Cholesterol is a product of animals, not plants. So they're often paired with cholesterol. And then, of course, the protein and the fat, you tend to find them together in animal foods. So let's go over this one by one. Again, water, calorie free. It takes up a lot of space in our stomach and it digests quickly. So, generally speaking, you don't want things to go through you quick, but water is sort of one of those exceptions. Vegetables, okay? We're going to go over different kinds of food now. Vegetables are about 100 calories per pound. And remember, when we're looking at that diagram of foods that are high in carbs and high in fiber, why are vegetables 100 calories per pound? Because they contain more water and more fiber and only small amounts or moderate amounts of carbohydrates, moderate amounts of protein, and very little fat. That's why vegetables are so low in their caloric density. They also tend to be extremely high in things like vitamins and minerals. There's lots of fiber, lots of water, and there's no fat, very low in fat. There's no added fat. No added fat. That's important. So fruit, we're moving along the scale here. Each slide is getting higher in calories. 300 calories per pound for fruit. Why? Because fruits tend to be higher in carbohydrates, but we're also seeing that they have fiber in them and water. There's also moderate amounts of protein and low amounts, generally speaking, of fat, with the exception of avocados and coconuts. Intact carbohydrates. So now we're talking about grains. So things like rice, wheat, millet, farro, okay, barley. These foods have about 500 calories per gram, or 500 calories per pound, I apologize, or 1 calorie per gram. There's lots of fiber and water, right? Because as we cook them, they're absorbing water. There are also moderate amounts of protein. You can get a good amount of protein from grains. They're low in fat, and there's no added fat. That's why we see this American Heart Association certification, because foods that are high in fiber bind to cholesterol in our intestines and help lower our blood level of cholesterol. Beans. Beans are going to be higher in carbs and higher in fat, but they also are very, very high in fiber. Some of the highest fiber foods available are beans. They average about 600 calories per pound versus 500 calories per pound for grains. So when we look at foods here, we have 2 chicken nuggets or a cup of lentil soup. Both of these foods are 100 calories. But why are we feeling more full on the lentil soup than the chicken nuggets? Well, it's obvious, because the lentil soup is bigger. It's heavier. It activates the stretch receptors in our stomach, which sends a message to our brain saying we're full. And it is full of fiber, which has no calories but takes up space. Whereas with the chicken nuggets, there is 0 fiber in that chicken nugget. There's very little carbohydrates except that little breaded coating. But how do you make chicken nuggets? They're deep fried. And so we're talking about oils. Remember, oils are 4,100 calories per pound. And so you have this chicken nugget that you've now tripled the amount of calories that it has in it by frying it. So moving along here, we're going to look at meat. So average protein, right? Meat is about 100 calories per pound. Okay? There's no fiber. There's no water. They are high amounts of protein and varying amounts of fat. It depends. So here we have a chicken that's 80% protein, 20% fat, or we have a steak here that's about 50-50 mix. Now keep in mind, there's nearly about the same amount of cholesterol between these two products. So when you eat things like wild game, elk or venison, they are going to be lower in fat like the chicken, but there's going to have the same amount of cholesterol. The cholesterol content does not change. And there was a very interesting study actually done by the meat industry, and it compared the effects of chicken versus beef on blood cholesterol. And what they found was there's the same effect. The same effect, and so they concluded that, well, Americans should just be allowed to have steak then. Instead of saying, well, then maybe if chicken has the same effect in our blood cholesterol levels as steak, we should just avoid both of them. So processed foods. These foods have no water in them, very low in fiber. They have things like added sugar, which is highly calorically dense. And they also have things like added oils and added fats. That's why we're looking at an average of 1,400 to 2,300 calories per pound, because no part of it has volume or weight that doesn't have any calories. Every bit of that food has calories, and they're often high in calories, high calories. So when we're looking at these two foods here, you could either have a cup of cornmeal, or you can have 4 ears of corn. Now, the 4 ears of corn is going to have a lot of fiber, a lot of water. It's going to take up space. Now, with the cornmeal, the problem with the cornmeal is that we're not just eating the cornmeal, because cornmeal doesn't really taste very good at all. To eat the cornmeal, we mix it with salt, fat, and sugar, and we make things called cornbread. And so we eat the cornbread, and that's why cornbread, generally speaking, is going to be more fattening than corn, because you're adding things like sugar and oils to it, which have no fiber, no water, and it's just all calories. Oils are the highest on the list. We're looking at 4,000 calories per pound. There's no fiber, there's no water, there's no protein. It's all fat. And when you look at the vitamin and mineral profile, because you see a lot of these people saying olive oil is healthy, coconut oil is healthy, but when we pull up the vitamin and mineral sheets here, you notice that with the exception of some vitamin E, which I see thousands of patients a year, and I've never seen a patient that was vitamin E deficient. So what we're finding here is that it's all calories and that's about it. And that vitamin K down there that you see, you don't even need the vitamin K from the oil. You get vitamin K from leafy greens, so that's not even an issue. That's a non-issue. A lot of times when people uh, self-proclaimed nutrition experts talk about foods, they often talk about, well, this is the benefit of the food. So before you buy into something because a food has a benefit, you should first ask yourself, do you need that benefit? Do you even need it? So, you could say, it's high in vitamin E. Well, without it, would I be deficient in vitamin E? No, you wouldn't. So it's not even a selling point. It's not even a selling point. Again, nature intended us to eat foods as close to her as possible. And so when we take 40 olives and we squeeze them out, we press them out, we get 1 to 2 tablespoons of olive oil. So nature intended us to eat the high fiber, high water content of the olives and not extract out the individual ingredient, the fat, that we're looking at here and eat that in isolation. Nature never intended us to eat anything in isolation. That's why supplements don't work. That's why oils aren't healthy. And that's why all these powders aren't healthy either, because we're not supposed to eat these foods in isolation. They are vastly, vastly superior when they're in the entire package. So, when we're looking at weight loss, keeping in mind everything that we've shared so far, how can we apply that to our own life? How can we apply that to our weight loss goals? So you see here that oils, 500 calories of oil, right? Nutrient dense, 100% fat, no water, no fiber, takes up no space in our stomach. That's why foods high in oil like fried foods and dried goods and added oils are going to be very, very weight gaining. Things like cheese, again, no carbs, very little carbs, almost none, no fiber, no water. So very, very calorically dense. Meat, okay, now we're getting more protein, less fat, so it's going to take up more space in our stomach, but it's still 500 calories. It looks like we can do better. So things like potatoes, rice, and beans. Look at this. We're getting really full off of 500 calories of rice and beans. Why? Because they're taking up a lot of space in our stomach with all that fiber and that water, but without adding any calories. It's not adding any calories. And then likewise for the fruits and vegetables here all the way at the end. And this is another version of what we've just went over. The diagram here is showing vegetables averaging about 100 calories per pound, oils about 4,000 to 4,100 calories per pound, and everything in between. Now keep in mind, they did some studies and they found that in order for people to actually lose weight, you need to hover right around the 560 calorie per pound average. So over the course of a day, you need to hover right between 500 and 600 calories per pound. So a nice even mix of vegetables, fruits, unprocessed carbohydrates like potatoes and rice, and legumes like beans, and maybe just a small amount of animal products, because again, we're looking at a 400 calorie jump per pound going from beans to chicken. Now, to maintain your weight, right around 800 to 1,200 calories. But people that hover around the 800 to 1,200 calorie per pound mark, okay, we're looking at things like legumes, animal products like chicken and beef, and processed carbohydrates and junk food. What we're finding is that the only people who eat like that actually maintain their weight are elite athletes. But I heard carbs are bad, right? Carbs are the enemy, right? We hear that all the time. They cause spikes in insulin, and fructose is the devil. But what we find is that high carbohydrate foods are the best. When you look across the country, when you look across the world, at the populations that are the healthiest, that have the lowest risk of chronic disease, you find that these are all carbohydrate-rich societies. When you go to Asian restaurants and you look at their menu, all of the meals are listed based on the carbohydrate source, whether it's rice, or noodles. They're high in vitamins and minerals, carotenoids, and phytochemicals, protective plant chemicals that reduce our risk for things like cancer. Very high in micronutrients, trace minerals, and that prebiotic fiber that we talked about earlier. So low carbohydrates often lead to weight loss in the form of water loss at the expense of micronutrients. So when we follow low carb diets, we lose glycogen stores, sugar stores in our muscles, which causes weight loss in the form of water loss. That's why we see about 5-pound weight loss very quickly with low-carb diets. But the problem is these low-carb diets, you're missing out on things like fiber and vitamins and minerals that are very, very rich in carbohydrate-based foods. Now, I sort of hinted at this earlier, but nature wants us to eat foods as close to her as possible. The more processing, the farther the food has come from the farm to table, the worse off it's going to be for you. Eat the way that it grew in the garden or out of the field. So things like barley and rice and oatmeal, these are exactly how they look when they come out of the field. You want them intact, not turned into flours. Now, some whole grain flours aren't necessarily bad for us, but they're not as good as the intact carbs like quinoa, barley, oats, rice, potatoes, fruits. Okay? Unrefined. Refined carbs are bad. Sugars, candies, desserts, crackers, and chips. So oftentimes you hear people talk about the bad advice by the U.S. government back in the 90s that said, they wanted the American public to reduce their intake of fat. They wanted everyone to go low fat. And we see an increase in obesity during that time period. So a lot of people have said, well, then obviously it's not the fat, it's the carbohydrates. We should blame the carbohydrates because people cut back on the fat and gained weight. But when we look at the data, what we find is that people were eating an additional 330 calories per day on the low-fat diet. They were eating more. That's what led to the weight gain, okay? But why? Why were they having the weight gain? Because they were eating bad carbs. They were eating low-fat Twinkies, low-fat chips, low-fat candy, and low-fat crackers. None of these foods were intended for us to eat. The government did not want us to eat these foods. The government was saying, go low-fat, eat things like oatmeal, brown rice, fruits, vegetables, whole grains, potatoes. That's what the government wanted us to eat, not this junk at the bottom. So when I go shopping, one of the things I look for is the word whole. It has to say whole on the ingredient label. See, this product, you say 100% organic, hard red spring wheat. That looks pretty good, Sean, but it's not because it's not whole. They took out part of that grain that has a lot of the valuable nutrients and vitamins and minerals. You want it to say whole here, whole. What do 300 calories look like? People say, well, potatoes are carbs and carbs are bad and they make you fat. And the problem isn't the it's not the potatoes, it's not the rice. What it is it's how it's prepared. So if you put a whole bunch of butter on your potato is only about 150 calories. But when you slice that potato up and you deep fry in oils, right? So oils are 4,100 calories per pound. You triple the calories of that potato because you're eating all that oil that takes up no space in your stomach but only adds calories. So you can have 2 baked potatoes or you can have a medium-sized french fry. So shopping tips real quick. I stick to the perimeter of the store. So when you walk in, the first thing you see is the produce. So I spend a lot of time in the produce section. Fresh fruits that are high in fiber, water, and nutrients. Short shelf life. The longer the food shelf life, the shorter yours. So the only other section I go to the produce section, and then I go to the bulk bin section. I get all my dried beans, legumes, lentils, nuts and seeds, and whole grains. Foods that when you're talking about money, right? Because a lot of people are interested in saving money. The cheapest foods in the grocery store are the plant foods. And this has been proven time and time again in the scientific literature that the cheapest foods are not the chicken and the beef, the eggs and the milk. The cheapest foods are things like whole grains and beans and bananas. 10-minute brown rice. Here, you got $2.50 a pound uncooked. But when you cook it, you're probably getting about 2 to 3 pounds out of that. So less than $1 a pound for that food. Now try and find me some chicken. Try and find me some beef or some fish that's $1 a pound or less. Whole wheat pasta, again, all of these are calculated at their dry weight. Canned beans, low in sodium, whole big thing. Less than $1 for that can of beans. So we're moving away from the standard American diet that's high in refined grains, lots of dairy and meat that have fat in them, they have protein, low in carbs, no fiber, and lots of cholesterol. So we need to move away from having oils as a major source of calories, having animal products at every meal. These are nutrient poor calories, very nutrient poor. When we think about the foods highest in nutrient density, Google it. Go Google foods high in nutrient density. You'll find that if there is some sort of animal product on there, sometimes they put fish on there, but generally speaking, 90 to 100% of these lists are going to have vegetables and fruits and beans and nuts and seeds as the really nutrient high foods. We need to use oils sparingly, lots of produce and fewer animal products. So that's it for the slideshow. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know if you have any questions and stay tuned for more.